Before I begin the story, I must say that it seems untrue to me, yet it's interesting enough to hear. My wife wanted half of everything I owned in the divorce after sleeping with her ex, so I disappeared without a trace. I thought the day couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. The whole week at work had been terrible, and to top it all off, my boss, the company president, called me into his office to reprimand me for a mistake someone else made. When I got home, I discovered that my sister-in-law's car was blocking the driveway while Ada was preventing me from parking in front of my house. The neighbor's teenage son and his friends had filled the street with parked cars, forcing me to park 3 doors down. As I entered the house, I wondered why my relationship with my wife's sister Susan bothered me. It had always been tense since the day we met. I couldn't understand why, but she seemed to harbor an immediate antipathy toward me. Besides, I had little hope of having an intimate evening with my wife Giannis, since we hadn't been intimate in almost a month, despite my persistent attempts. As I reached my driveway, I noticed an empty trash can on the sidewalk and dragged it around the house through the side door, placing it next to the back door. Entering the kitchen, I heard music, and my wife and her sister talking in the living room. I was grabbing a beer from the refrigerator and took a swig before heading into the living room. However, a phrase I overheard at the door stopped me in my tracks. God dodged me 3 times today. I thought it wasn't coming from my sister-in-law, but from my beloved wife. Ever since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of him. My wife confessed she knew Brandon as her ex-boyfriend, who dumped her and moved out. Curious, my wife's sister asked, "So what are you going to do now?" "Janny, Brandon wants me to move in with him," she replied. "So I'm getting a lawyer and filing for divorce. This is a community property state, so I'll get half." Of everything, I'd heard enough. I headed for the back door and retraced my steps to my car. Opening the door, I sank into the driver's seat, giving myself, "Now." I understand the reason why I was denied any intimacy with my wife. She was sharing it with someone else and now wanted half of everything. The worst part was that the state would probably grant it to her. Giannis and I had only been married for 3 years. She quit her job right after our vows, and when she was home, she never lifted a finger. I hired a maid 3 times a week for cleaning and laundry, and on those days I cooked dinner. The rest of the time, either I cooked or she ordered takeout. I know what you might be thinking, but love put dark circles under my eyes. She kept me happy by providing good sex, at least until a month ago. My mother passed away when I was 13, a devastating loss for both my father and me. My dad did his best to raise me well, and we became very close. Losing him in a car accident when I was 23 was a significant blow, occurring just a year before I met Giannis. I inherited almost $22 million from my father, which I wisely kept invested. The guidance of a good broker. Despite Janice's attempts to spend every penny she earned, I had hundreds of thousands more in savings. I had never touched the inheritance, making it grow. Even in the current economy, I had enough to live comfortably and didn't need to spend it. My love for Janice led us to overlook a prenuptial agreement, a stupid mistake many make thinking their marriage will last forever. This oversight meant she could potentially take almost $1.5 million from me, all for the privilege of opening my legs. The state seemed all too willing to endorse this legalized form of exploitation. She had mentioned getting a lawyer, indicating she wasn't yet ready to file the paperwork. I knew I had some time to act, formulating a plan. I sat in my car watching the rearview mirror until I saw my sister-in-law's car pull out and drive away. I started. The car turned around and walked back to my driveway. When I entered the house, Giannis wasn't in sight, so I headed to the kitchen for another beer, opening the can and taking a long swig while contemplating my next steps. "Oh, there you are, honey," Giannis greeted, entering the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hi, darling, I just got here. It's been a long day," I replied with a loving smile, determined to play the part as convincingly as she did. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she said with a slight, "though I wanted to say that's because you spent the day with your boyfriend, sharing every detail with your sister." What I said was, "Okay, honey, just warming up last night's work." She gave me a sweet smile. She kissed me on the cheek and announced she was going upstairs to enjoy a hot bath, smiling and nodding. I thought, yeah, I have to wash everything. When she left, I grabbed a plate of fried rice and ate it cold while drinking 2 more beers. After throwing away the empty container, I retreated to the study and settled on the couch, passing by channel surfing. I settled on an old movie. When Giannis returned about 30 minutes later, she sat on the sofa until the movie ended. Standing up, she claimed she was tired and going to bed. Yes, tired of being unfaithful. I told her I would watch the news and join her later. I didn't really pay attention to the movie. My mind was preoccupied with devising my next move. Knowing I couldn't do much until Monday, I endured. The next few days working in the garden on Saturday and playing golf with friends on Sunday. On Monday, I called my broker who managed my inheritance portfolio and liquidated everything. Being in senior management allowed me to quickly cash out my 401k despite the penalties. By Thursday, I was ready to act. Upon returning home to my supposedly loving wife, I informed her of an emergency, explaining that I would be flying for a week on business. I packed 2 suitcases. That was all I needed. When we moved into this house, I stored everything important to me. Nothing suited her taste, so I didn't want anything else. The furniture was her choice, and frankly, I didn't care. The only advantage in this situation was that we were renting the house. So I had no financial investment in it. Having recently sold my condo, we were in the process of finding the right house to buy. When I say right, I mean right by their standards. So far, none of the houses we had seen seemed to meet their criteria. One Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek for the last time and carried my suitcases out the door, loading them into my Lexus. I drove without looking back even once. My first stop was at the house of an old friend, Jack, whom I trusted implicitly. He was surprised when I proposed trading titles for his older but rebuilt SUV. The car I traded him was hidden in the garage for a while. Over the next 4 days, I paid everything in cash. I had canceled all our credit cards to avoid leaving a trace. Most of my money was now safe in an offshore account. Thanks to my broker, I had a system in place with him to arrange fund transfers when needed. I had enough cash hidden in the SUV to last for a while. The lonely nights in motels were the hardest. During the last week, I had been too busy running. My plan was to reflect on what had happened to me. Personally, I had loved Yanis. I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. I went over several scenarios of EC in my mind, but in the end, I concluded there wasn't much I could have done differently. Even if I had known her old boyfriend had returned, I doubted I could have kept them apart. I came to 2 conclusions. She probably never truly loved me, and it was my own fault for being foolish enough to marry her. On the 5th day away from home, I found myself sitting in a small-town restaurant in Montana. I reflected on what my supposedly loving wife would be doing, since by this time she should have discovered that all her credit cards were canceled and our bank account was empty. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple at the next table, whose quiet conversation I couldn't help but overhear. The man, who appeared to be in his 50s, was telling his red-haired wife about his desire for an extra hand on their farm. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford to hire anyone until their current calves were ready for market. Even then, finding someone willing to work for what they could pay proved challenging. Finishing the last bite of my meal, I stood up and approached their table, apologizing for eavesdropping but suggesting I could help. The older man scrutinized me, assessing what we were talking about. I can't pay you anything. What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my work? I proposed. His eyes narrowed. Excuse us for a moment while I talk to this young man outside, he said to his wife, rising. He waited for me to follow him. Once in a parking lot where our conversation would remain private, he turned to me. I estimated him to be my same height, 6 feet, with broad shoulders and not an ounce of fat. His once dark hair was mostly gray, and his face showed the rough lines of years working outdoors. Who the hell are you? Are you part of that Wilson farm? He asked with a hint of suspicion. I raised my hands defensively and I said, Wait a minute, sir. I don't know anything about any Wilson. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas and I got here this morning. I thought maybe we could help each other out. He replied, If what you're saying is true, why would you want to help us? I can't pay you. What's in it for you if you're on the run from the law? We don't need that kind of trouble. I probably am on the run like you said, but not in the way you might think. I said, I'm just trying to keep what's rightfully mine. If you have a place where I can stay, I'll pay you back with my work. I'll pay my own way. And if you don't think it would be helpful, just tell me and I'll leave without a grudge. He studied my face and said, If what you're telling me is true, I think I'd be a fool if I didn't at least give you a chance. But I should tell you beforehand that the Wills are trying to convince me to sell my land. They haven't done anything dishonest yet, but I wouldn't put that beyond them. You might be taking on more than you can handle. I informed him that it was a risk I was willing to take. Then he asked about my experience in ranching, and I was honest. I admitted that I spent some time summers on my uncle's ranch in Texas, but he wasn't a cowboy. He extended his hand and we sealed our agreement. He suggested I call him by his first name, Bill, and I made the introduction. We returned to the restaurant where Colin was waiting. He said to Colin, "This is Carson. She's going to work for us if you can handle it." He stood up and extended his hand. I shook it and she greeted me warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Carson." Her voice was clear with perhaps a hint of an Irish accent like her husband's. She was slim and fit, and I said, "It's a pleasure to meet you too, ma'am." She replied, "The last name is Bugman, but just call me Colin. We really don't have much use for formality in this part of the country." I immediately liked this friendly lady. Bill suggested we head back to the ranch. Before leaving town, he stopped at a general store and we both got out of the vehicle. He said, "Perhaps you'd like to buy some suitable clothes for working on the ranch." Upon entering the store, he received a warm greeting from the owner, clearly a regular customer. A coat and a pair of Western-style riding boots were sufficient for a week. From the general store, it was approximately a 20-minute drive to the front gate with the arched name Rockin' B. Ranch Bill's Rockin' B brand. Another kilometer of private road led to the main house perched on a hill. Their two-story house looked well-maintained and freshly painted. Behind it appeared a barn and several outbuildings. The pickup truck they were driving was partially loaded with bags of groceries, indicating their weekly trip to town to stock up. I parked behind them, tied my arms with bags, and followed the Buckmans to the kitchen. In 2 trips, we unloaded the truck Bill instructed me to drive back, where he showed me a small cabin for my stay. As I turned around, I saw him standing in front of the cabin. When I got out, he pointed to the cabin and mentioned that Sam used a similar one a few feet away, adding that Sam was doing his rounds and I would meet him later. After unpacking my bags, he waited while I settled into the cabin. It was a large room with a bed along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove in one corner, and a bathroom with the stone shower. Wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and served as a suitable place to stay. For now, at least, allowing me to avoid being found by Giannis. When I returned outside, he was sitting in his truck and told me to get in. He took me on a tour of the ranch, which encompassed almost 6,000 acres of pasture land and a couple hundred acres set aside for growing winter fodder. The mountainous wooded back section of the ranch led to mountains with a creek flowing through the property, accessible only on horseback. He shared that he used to have 3 full-time employees, but Sam was the only one left after hard times. Sam had been working on the ranch for almost 30 years. During cattle drives to market, they hired extra help. He dropped me off at the small cabin. "Oh, by the way, I noticed you have a laptop. I have a satellite connection with a router so you can access the internet wirelessly. Dinner is in the main house and we usually eat at 16, he mentioned before driving off in less than 30 minutes. I was settled in, giving me time to turn on my computer. As he had mentioned, I was able to make a wireless connection, and I quickly checked my emails. There was a message from Jack indicating that Janice had reported me missing to the police and they were investigating my disappearance. It gave me something to think about. Jack was the only one I had actually told about my departure, and even he didn't know where I was going. I had sent my resignation to my former employer, but I hadn't informed them in person about my departure. Just before 600, I walked to the main house and knocked on the door. Bill called me in, and as I crossed the threshold, I saw Colin preparing lunch while Bill was talking to a man I assumed was Sam. Bill beckoned me closer. "Sam, this is Carson, the new farmhand I told you about. At least for today, we'll see how he feels about it after a day's work," he said with a broad smile. "Carson, meet Sam." Sam gave me a warm smile and extended his hand. A large man at least 6 or 3. Like Bill, seemed to have worked hard all his life and appeared to be the same age as Bill. One notable detail, he was African American. I shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. "Well, young man, we hope you like it here. I could use..." The help said, at 28 years old. I was about half her age, so I considered myself young. I replied, I planned to do my best at that moment. Colin called us to sit down as dinner was ready. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and Yami to sit between them facing each other. On the table was a large plate of pork chops, a large bowl of mashed potatoes, another with fresh green beans, and a plate piled high with evidently homemade crackers. "We don't eat fancy." "Here, Carson," I said. "But there's plenty and it's satisfying." Colin said, "It looks great," I replied. As we ate, I asked Bill if he had been here all his life. His answer was, yes. My grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my father. Now, it belongs to me, Colin said. Although when I was younger, I wasn't so sure she was going to be a part of it. I had to fight every man to get her. He looked at his wife, and I could see the depth of his love for her in his eyes. She replied, "Now, Bill, you're the only man I ever looked at. I just had to make sure that I wish enough," Bill continued. "My wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life: the day she agreed to marry me, the day she actually did, and the day she gave birth to our daughter Caitlin." I hadn't seen any sign of a daughter, and Colin must have noticed my curious look. He said, "Our daughter is away right now. She's finishing her PhD in veterinary science at South Dakota State University. She's only been able to come home for the holidays, and we're eagerly awaiting her return with her degree. She's supposed to be home in a couple of months," Bill added. "It'll be nice having a veterinarian in the family. I should cut some expenses." After dinner, I tried to help clear the dishes, but Colin insisted it was his job and showed me the way Bill mentioned that breakfast was at 5:30 and work would start at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter, probably picked up by Bill in town. I asked if I could take it, front page, and he agreed. Once outside, I asked him to come into my cabin for a moment. Inside, I took out my digital camera and showed him how to use it. I had him take a close-up of me holding the front page of the newspaper. I could tell he was curious, but he didn't ask if he asked about an alarm. I reassured him that I was alive and well, and that I had left town of my own free will. Choosing a national newspaper instead of a local one kept my location ambiguous. I emailed Jack and instructed him to use one of the local coffee shops with free internet access. Since my work, email would probably still be active. I provided my password, so he could forward the original email and photo to the police without leaving a trace. This way, I hope to avoid being listed on any FBI missing persons lists or channels, assuming the police wouldn't allocate extensive resources to searching for a runaway husband. I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I woke up at 5, showered, and dressed in time to walk with Sam to the main house. After breakfast, Bill instructed Sam to put me to work, replacing fence posts in the hilly section. Sam, up to the barn, pointed out a horse and saddle he would need. He seemed pleased with the way he saddled the big brown mare. Drawing on my experience on my uncle's farm, we then took 2 mules attaching saddlebags to carry fence posts and a hole punch. Bill joined us at the barn carrying a Winchester Model 94 and a saddle cover, explaining that it was mainly for the rare occasion when we might need to put down a sick cow. Riding and leading a mule, each Sam and I headed off following the stream, into the hills. As Sam and I rode, we struck up a conversation and got to know each other. I shared the story of how I ended up in Manana, trusting that he wouldn't betray my confidence. In return, he recounted his own experiences. He got married right after high school, only to discover his ex-wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, he had almost beaten the guy to death, which resulted in a 5-year prison sentence. After his release, Bill was the only one willing to give him an opportunity, and so I had spent the last 30 years here. Sam spoke very highly of Bill and Colin, considering them the salt of the earth. Half an hour later, we reached the fence that marked the boundaries of the property. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed to be replaced, only those that were rotten or about to be. Approximately every third stayed with me. While I replaced the first 2 to make sure I was doing it correctly, he suggested working until around 4, which would allow me enough time to get back, take care of the horse and mules, and be home for supper at 6. His parting advice was to follow the stream back down, making sure I didn't get lost. He left, leaving me alone with my work. I made my way along the line, replacing old posts with new ones. At midday, I paused and took out the pork chop sandwiches that Colin had given me in the morning for my saddlebag. I finished my sandwiches and went back to work. My watch alarm went off at 4 p.m. I noticed that I had put up all but a couple of the posts that the mules had. Led by the mules, I backed up along the fence until I found the stream and began to descend. Just before emerging from the trees, I discovered a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out. I stopped and admired the view, recognizing it as the most beautiful and serene spot on the ranch. Back at the barn, I managed to unsaddle the animals and feed them on time. While tending to the horses, Sam came in to put his horse to bed. We hurried to wash and change before dinner, where we enjoyed steaks. That night, exhausted, I made minimal contributions to the conversation and excused myself immediately after dinner to go to bed. Sleep came quickly, and I slept soundly. When I woke up, my whole body ached. My hands hurt from handling the post hole digger, and my arms, shoulders, and legs felt it too. There was a huge difference between a 2-hour gym session and a full day putting up fence posts. As I hobbled to the kitchen, I made faces as I sat down. I received a few laughs from Billy Sam, and even Colin couldn't completely hide his grin. However, despite the pain, I was ravenously hungry and devoured my breakfast, eager for another day of fencing. As we got up from the table, I nodded and replied, "Yes, sir," hoping to sound more optimistic than I felt. Bill laughed. "I think you can rest today. I'd like you to walk around the ranch." With Sam, I nodded gratefully. The first task was to clean the stables and replace the hay after putting the horses and mules in the pasture and filling their feed troughs. We got in the truck and began our tour of the ranch. Our main objective was to make sure there were no cows that had fallen or been separated from their mothers. Sam's knowledge of the ranch seemed instinctive. He effortlessly anticipated where the cows would be and roughly estimated their number. After 30 years, it seemed to come naturally to him. Upon reaching the far end of the ranch, Sam stopped the truck and surveyed the surroundings. Something on one of the hills caught his attention. He handed me his binoculars and pointed to a specific spot. After a minute, I identified 2 cows apparently alone. I asked where their mothers were, and he pointed to 2 cows near the tree line. "There they are. Their mothers must have wandered into the trees, gotten lost, and gone on ahead. We'll have to get them down," I asked. "Let's go up there. It's not too far. We'll come back and load up a couple of horses." The trucks were equipped with 2-way radios, and Sam called Bill informing him of what we had seen and that we were on our way to get the horses. When we returned to the barn, Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them onto a trailer. All we had to do was get supplies and leave. Sam led us near the tree line below where the calves were, and we unloaded the horses heading up the hills. Sam's 30 years on the ranch were evident once again as he knew the terrain like the back of his hand. Half an hour later, we gently approached the calves and slowly began to push them back down. I couldn't help but laugh when we emerged from the trees and the lost youngsters saw their mothers. They ran mooing to them and immediately sought a teat to nurse. The larger cows remained, patiently allowing their calves to nurse. I was struck by how different it was from my childhood dinner that night, included fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. With renewed energy, I talked more than the night before and learned more about Colin. Her parents emigrated to the United States from Ireland when she was 5 years old. Her father, fascinated by stories of the Old West, took the family to Montana, explaining the trace of an Irish accent in her speech. Growing up in America, Colin still retained the influence of her parents. Feeling much better the next day, I went back to replacing fence posts. After breakfast, Sam helped me load the mules, but this time I went alone following the creek. I arrived directly at my destination. This day turned out to be easier than the first, as I learned some tricks to make the work less tiring. Just before 4, I put up the last post and headed back to the barn. With some extra time, I worked on some of the barns before cleaning up for dinner. On my 4th day, I helped Sam make repairs on some of the buildings, and the next day I put up more fence posts. The next 2 months flew by, and now I took turns checking on the cattle. I was in the best shape of my life. We established a schedule. Where Sam took Saturdays off, I checked on Sundays, and Mondays were my days off. I used my day to do laundry and go into town if necessary. I had grown very fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and easy to get along with, and we often sat and talked after dinner. I had a lot of respect for Bill. He was honest and hardworking. We got along well. Colin was very kind to Sam and me, but I could see a certain determination in her. Together, she and Bill made a great pair. Colin and Bill were excited during breakfast on Friday. Colin informed me that his daughter would be returning home in a week. That day, it was my turn to take a horse and ride through the wooded section, checking for any cattle that might have strayed into the hills. A little after 400, I headed to the stream. I followed its course downstream and arrived at the pool below the waterfall. I stopped, dismounted, took off my shirt, and knelt by the water, dipping my handkerchief in the cool water. I began to wash the sweat and dust from my face and neck. A whinny downstream caught my attention, and I looked to my right to see a horse and rider approaching. At first I thought it was Kali, but I quickly realized it was a younger version of her. This beautiful woman could only be Caitlin, with the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She approached and stopped several feet away from me as I stood up and looked at her. she asked in a cold tone. Who are you and what are you doing on this property? I said, my name is Carson and I work here. She said, I don't believe you. My dad said he couldn't afford to pay another helper. Despite her beauty. I was starting to get irritated by her unfriendly tone and said, yeah, I heard that too. I guess that's why I laugh all the way to the bank every payday. She looked at me, turned her horse around and slapped it on the flanks. I laughed. To myself, put my shirt back on, mounted my horse, and continued toward the stable. Later, I learned there had been a mix-up between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home the following week. Instead, to their surprise, she arrived. A few hours after I had gone riding, she spent the morning and the first part of the afternoon with her parents until she expressed her desire to go horseback riding was something she hadn't had time to do during school, but she loved it. So she saddled up and rode to her favorite spot, the waterfall and the pool. I guess after 2 months it was old news and Bill and Colin forgot to mention me. Just as I was heading back to the barn, I saw the redhead disappear inside. I got off and proceeded. To leave my horse inside, Caitlin must have been looking for her father, and she finally found him in the barn. I could clearly hear her loud voice when she asked, who's that man at the waterfall? Bill thought for a minute and said, that must have been Carson. She added, he said he works here, but the last time I was here you told me you couldn't afford to pay another employee. Bill replied, well, she's right. He works here. As for how much he gets paid, I don't think that's any of your business. I still run this ranch, young lady. She stammered, but he said you pay him so much that he laughs. On the way to the bank at that moment, I entered the barn. She had her back to me and didn't see me. But Bill smiled at me and said, that's right, Carson. If you think you're being paid too much, I can rectify that. She turned around and glared at me. I tipped my hat with one hand and scratched the back of my neck with the other, saying, well, it would be a shame to take advantage of you, Bill. How are you thinking of cutting my pay? At that moment, Bill and I burst out laughing. She just kept glaring at us, not seeing the humor, honey. Just to get that idea out of your head, Carson stays in the cabin next to Sam's. Bill said. She replied, and what else? Bill answered. That's it, and he gets the chance to enjoy your mother's excellent cooking. Caitlin persisted. So you're saying you're not paying him? Why would he work for free? Bill replied. He has his reasons, and it's not my place to tell you. Then I chimed in. Working to get the chance to try your mother's cooking is worth a lot, and I don't think she'd like to hear you say it's worthless. She shot me one more look and left the barn. Bill shook his head and said, she reminds me so much of his mother when she was young, I didn't think she'd ever, Maria, to Colin at dinner. That night, Caitlin joined us and sat next to Sam on the opposite side of the table. She shot me another sharp look. When I entered the kitchen, I waited until everyone had filled their plates. Before speaking, I said in a friendly tone, your mother told me you finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine. Yes, was her one-word reply given without looking up. I continued. Sam says there's only one other veterinarian in the area and he's over 30 miles away. I'm sure you'll be a great asset to the people of this area. She looked up at my praise and I thought I saw her eyes soften a little. Yes, that would be Dr. Harrison. He has more work than he can handle, and they often need him in more than one place at the same time. Bill added, I agree with you, Carson. Our Kitling will be able to provide great service. For the rest of the meal, Caitlin spoke with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch since before she was born. She didn't speak directly to me, and I mostly remained silent. This was her homecoming, and I knew that her parents and Sam, they wanted to hear what had happened in his life while he was away. As soon as I finished eating, I excused myself to leave. I returned to my cabin and checked my email, seeing that I had one from Jack. He reported that he had spoken to a friend of his in the police force, casually asking if they still considered me a missing person. His friend said that everything had been closed after receiving the email with the photo. I sent them as for Janice. It seemed Brandon had left her as soon as he found out I had disappeared with all the money, and it didn't seem like Janice was going to get her hands on anything anytime soon. Of course, she couldn't afford the rent on the house we lived in, and now she was living in a city apartment working as a waitress. She didn't have money to hire a lawyer to chase me down. I found it ironic. Apparently, she had only married me for my money, and her boyfriend only wanted her for the same reason. My money was still working replacing fence posts. Now I only did it every third or fourth day. I had moved from the hills and was in an area where I could drive the truck to the job site. It was actually easier to load the posts in the back of the truck instead of on the mules. The morning after Caitlin returned home, I loaded the truck with posts and drove to where I had left. When it was my normal lunchtime, I went to the truck and realized I hadn't brought my lunch. If either of us was going to work far from the main house, everything that day, Colin made sure we had lunch, and I guess I forgot to pick mine up. I could have gone back to the house, but I decided missing a meal wasn't going to kill me. About 30 minutes later, I had just put up a post and was attaching the wire when I heard a vehicle approaching. I looked back and saw it was one of the ranch trucks. The truck stopped just as I finished with that post. I turned around and was surprised to see Caitlin get out. She had a small bag in her hand, like the ones Colin put our lunches in. "Mom said you forgot your lunch," she said, pushing the bag at me. I reached out and took it. "Thanks, Caitlin, that was very kind of you," I replied. I looked inside the bag and saw it contained 2 sandwiches as usual. I took one out and offered her the other, but she shook her head. I shrugged and went to sit on the back door of the truck to eat. She came over to where I was about 5 feet to one side and just looked at me. I stayed seated and ate, keeping my eyes focused straight ahead. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. I turned and looked at her and decided to play with her. I said, "You can't tell anyone I stole a bank and hid the money. I'm hiding here until the pressure eases and I can get the cash back." At first, her eyes widened. Then she glared at me. "You're a real clown," she snorted and turned to leave. I waited until she was halfway to her truck. Then I called her name. She heard me say her name, stopped, and turned around slowly. I said, "I married a woman who never loved me and only wanted the things I could provide. I ended up here because I just wanted to get away from everything I knew for a while." She looked at me again, and I think she decided that this time I was telling the truth. She nodded and left without another word as she drove away in her vehicle. I thought about what her father had said about her mother being like this when she was that age. He said he had tamed her, but I suspected the secret was their mutual love. It hadn't even been 24 hours since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't. I imagined no man could tame the fiery redhead. Dinner that night was practically a repeat of the night before inside. Caitlin had conversations with her parents and Sam. I didn't really feel slighted after all. She didn't know me, and we didn't have much in common. We were finishing dinner when there was a knock at the door, and Bill went to answer it. He entered the kitchen, followed by a man about my age. He was what women would call tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin excitedly called his name and jumped out of her seat to hug the guy. It was obvious they knew each other. They were chatting about how long it had been since they'd last seen each other. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door, and Bill went to answer it and came back with another man. This one was blonde but also attractive. He received an equally warm greeting from Caitlin. I remembered Bill's words about having to scare off all the men to win his wife. Caitlin was equally a prize, like her mother, at least in appearance. I excused myself from the table and returned to my cabin, mentally wishing the 2 guys luck. Although I envied them, if Caitlin turned out to be the woman her mother was, whoever won her affection would be a lucky man. The next day, I took the truck and toured the ranch. By the time I had completed my rounds, something didn't add up. It was early enough to go back and get Sam, and together we did a quick tour of the ranch. There were many cows scattered around the ranch, but we both agreed that something didn't feel right. It just seemed like we were missing some herds. We decided that the next day we would saddle up the horses and ride through the hilly areas. We discussed the situation with Vise at dinner, and he agreed with our plan. It rained that night, which would make finding tracks more difficult. The next morning we loaded our horses onto a trailer, and Bill took us to one end of the property. I rode about a third of the way to the tree line, and Sam rode another third higher up. Then we headed across the ranch over the hills and through the trees. It took us a large part of the day to get to the other side. We counted 5 stray herds. Bill found us as we left the hills. We loaded the horses onto the trailer and headed back. We discussed the situation and decided that the only thing we could do was be more vigilant. At dinner that night, Caitlin had another suitor visit her. I heard her mother mutter something about this being the 3rd one that day. News of her being back home had spread, and boys were coming out of the woodwork seeking her attention. Over the next 4 days, we spent a lot of time watching the herd. Everything seemed fine except for the original suspicious loss. Caitlin's Quakers kept visiting her. She had been home for a week and hadn't spoken more than 2 words to me since the day she brought me my lunch. On the 5th day after the cattle's supposed disappearance, I told Bill I wanted to walk the property line through the hills. We had already covered the fence lines along the pasture areas and hadn't seen any evidence that the missing cattle had passed through there. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch. This was where the ranch Week bordered Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I saw 3 sets of fresh horse tracks crossing from the Wilson side of the fence to Bill's side. The puzzling thing is that the fence wire was still standing. I dismounted and checked the fence posts and saw that the nails had loosened on 5 posts and were barely holding the wire. Remove the nails and lower the wire and you could cross. Put the wire and nails back on and it would look normal. I mounted again and followed the tracks. When I got close to the creek, I saw 3 horses tied to a tree, a little upstream from the waterfall. I was still about 30 yards away and quickly dismounted. I tied my horse to a tree and took my rifle out of its case. When I got to the horses, I could see boot prints heading downstream. I stealthily approached the edge of the waterfall and looked. There was Caitlin, in the pool. She was naked as the day she was born. I was mesmerized by the sight. She was swimming through the water. Her body, naked, clearly visible in the clear water. Damn, she had a cute ass. A movement in the trees to her right brought me back to reality. I quickly scanned the area and saw 1 guy on the right and 2 others approaching the pond from the left. I raised my rifle and the bullet hit near the feet of the guy on the right. A quicker pull of the trigger and the ground exploded. Near the 2 guys on the left, Caitlin let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. I stood up so everyone could see and yelled, "Ground. Now I won't miss on the next shot, Caitlin. Stay where you are." She didn't see the 3 men, she only saw me standing over her with a rifle in my hands, and she struggled to cover her body. One of the men on the left shuddered as if he was going to run, but the bark of the tree right next to him exploded when I pulled the trigger again, and he was convinced and lay flat. Caitlin looked towards where I had fired and saw the 2 men. She screamed again. I started counting backward, and before I could, one of them said it. The other 2 immediately threw themselves to the ground. I ordered them to put their hands behind their heads, and they did as ordered. I quickly asked Caitlin to leave and get dressed. She tried to protest, but I growled at her, telling her to get dressed and leave. She was clearly frightened, and I could see her trembling from where I stood, but she did as I commanded and emerged from the water like Venus rising from the sea. Though she kept her back to me, I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. The sight of her alabaster skin and the most perfectly rounded backside I'd ever beheld were forever etched in my mind. She simply pulled on her jeans and shirt, mounted her horse, and rode off into the trees. As she left, I ordered the men 1 by 1 to rise from the ground and lie down again. Only when all 3 stood before me did I breathe a sigh of relief. I decided it was time for a bluff. "So what am I going to do with you 3? I asked. "I suppose I could shoot you in the legs and watch you bleed to death." The 3 men began pleading with me to spare them. I said, "Even if I spare you, Caitlin's father will ensure justice is served when I inform him of your heinous intentions toward his daughter. Unless, of course, you have a more convincing confession for the sheriff, something like cattle rustling at thigh. Can lead to jail, but at least it guarantees them a chance at life." The smallest among them murmured, "Yes, we did it." Wilson said that defeating Bugman would secure his land. His colleague dropped it, but he replied, "I'm not going to die for damn cows." Anticipating this, Bill and Sam galloped. They stopped in sight. I signaled for them to come closer, and they ran towards me at the top of the hill. "What the hell is going on?" Bill demanded. "Looks like some of Wilson's men paid us an unwanted visit. I tracked him from the fence line to hear Caitlin was Nando, and these 3 were trying to sneak up on her looking down." I pressed the barrel of my rifle against the neck of the smallest man. "I think this one has something to confess to you," he whimpered again. "We did it." Wilson said that defeating Bugman would secure his land. Bill tilted his hat back, smiling at Sam, and said, "When my grandfather ran this ranch, they hanged horse thieves and rustlers. Sometimes justice seems simpler. In those days, too bad we have to be civilized these days." Sam was keeping watch. Bill and I decided to take the rustlers back. Rifles in hand, we followed them. Sam killed their horses together and closed in on them. When we reached the buildings, we took the rustlers to the stables. We placed them in separate stalls with open doors that allowed us to watch without them seeing each other. Bill went into the house to call the sheriff. In less than 30 minutes, the sheriff arrived at full speed along the Long Mile Road. Bill met with him, informing him of the ongoing events I proposed, bringing out the smallest culprit first, so the sheriff could interrogate him, and he agreed. Soon I had my prisoner outside. Initially hesitant, the little rustler seemed to reconsider speaking and began his silence. The sheriff looked at Bill and said, "Looks like we have a simple case of trespassing here. Honestly, it's a waste of my time. But I suppose I could leave them in your hands. Forget I saw them, I'll let you handle things." The rustler's frightened eyes widened, and suddenly they opened. Soon the sheriff extracted the calling for backup. A caravan of sheriff's vehicles soon entered Wilson's vast ranch. Despite its extensive size, the sheriff pinpointed the location provided by the rustler, discovering nearly 100 head of stolen cattle bearing the Rocking Bee brand. By the end of the day, Wilson and his accomplices were jailed. Amid the commotion, it was already past 9 when we gathered for dinner. Caitlin, though Ada was at the table, kept her eyes fixed on her plate. "What were you doing there?" Bill asked, turning to her as he hadn't had many opportunities to speak with her. "I was just swimming. I didn't think anyone would come to spy on me," she replied, giving me an accusing look. I intervened. "First of all, Caitlin, I wasn't spying on you. I followed the horse tracks to the creek. Secondly, consider what might have happened if I hadn't been there. I doubt those three were planning a picnic. When they saw you swimming naked, Colin remarked, 'Thank God you arrived when you did, Carson. I don't like to think what could have happened.' The conversation shifted, and we quickly finished our meal, aware of an early start the next day, leaving the kitchen for my cabin. Caitlin called me. I stopped and waited as she rudely blurted out, 'So you enjoyed the view today?' Expecting gratitude might seem too optimistic, so I replied, 'Let's just say it would be dishonest if I said it wasn't impressive.' She scoffed and turned, marching toward the house. I stood there shaking my head, acknowledging that there was something about me that consistently attracted her. The next day, Bill had to go into town to officially file charges against Wilson. Returning the stolen cattle to their rightful place would take several days, as the prosecutor needed to thoroughly document the case. First, Sam and I spent the day refreshing the paint on some of the exterior buildings. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin chose not to join us, a decision I thought was perfect. Bill returned in the early afternoon, but waited until dinner to share the events. He explained that since this wasn't a capital case, Wilson and his accomplices would be released on bail, though he didn't anticipate any further problems. He warned us to remain vigilant, glanced at his daughter, smiled mischievously, and said, "If you're planning another nude swim anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson with you." Not for protection. His face turned red again, and he dove as he stood up and ran into the room. Bill and Sam burst out laughing, and even Colin couldn't help but chuckle. I joined in with a laugh. After the laughter subsided, we continued with our meal. Bill continued with his friendly banter. "I really want to thank you, Carson Wilson. Having put this ranch in serious financial jeopardy, you're worth every penny." We all shared. Another round of laughter. 3 days later, Bill received the news that he could get his cattle back. We loaded 3 horses onto a trailer and headed to Wilson's Flydale Ranch, accompanied by an escort from Sheriff Colin. He came to drive the truck and trailer back. Once we unloaded the horses, Bill, Sam, and I started driving the cows back to his ranch. As we approached the Rockin' Bee Ranch, I went ahead and loosened the fence line, allowing the cows to cross. After making sure all the cows were back in place, we secured the fence and returned to the main house, satisfied with the day's work. During this time, Caitlin had applied for her veterinary license. As the approval process generally took about 45 days for now, she could only care for the animals on her father's ranch. I would see her around the property and, of course, at mealtimes. Despite her continued silent treatment, if I managed to catch her eye, I offered her a big smile and moved my eyebrows just enough to make her blush. 2 weeks after the incident at the waterfall, we met at the barn at the same time, and I asked, "Have you been enjoying a bath lately?" She came closer, standing inches away, and gave me a look. "Why are you such an idiot?" I shrugged, smiled, and said, "Why? Are you so annoying?" Her right hand was pointing at my face, but I reacted quickly, grabbing her wrist before she could strike. Without intimidating me, she tried with her left hand, but I caught that too. I pushed both hands back, holding her and forcing her body against mine. Slowly, I lowered my face to hers. She looked at me but made no effort to break free. Then I said, "If you were mine, I'd put you on my knees and spank you." Trying to back away, she replied, "No, you wouldn't dare." Suddenly, I released my grip and she fell backward, landing on her bottom. It's not that I wouldn't dare. I just got rid of a woman who didn't care about me, and I'm not wasting my time with another one. Traditionally, she was the one she was angry, but this time, it was my turn. I left the barn, leaving her sitting on the ground. I didn't see her again until dinner. Predictably, she didn't speak to me, but I couldn't decipher the look she gave me. Not that I've ever claimed to understand women anyway. My marriage to Janice proved that. The next day I was in the barn tending to the horses when Vil came in knowing it was his day off. On Sunday I thought he wanted to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him about the incident the day before and if he'd come. To ask me to leave, I stopped what I was doing as he approached. Then he said, "I heard you and Caitlin had a little falling out yesterday." Well, that answered my question about whether Caitlin had confided in her father. But I noticed a flash in his eyes. I said, "Yes, I suppose you could say that. It was probably my fault." He continued, maybe not. "I think her problem is she doesn't know what to do with you. First, she thought you were here for something. Then you became the hero who saved her, and the ranch. What she can't understand is, why don't you pursue her like the other local young men? Like her mother at her age. Caitlin is used to having boys around her. She's had a few boyfriends, but none of them lasted. I don't think I really respected him. I just hope you don't let her kick you out of my book." "You're welcome here as long as you like," I said. "Thank you, Bill. That means a lot to me, Caitlin. I'll stop bothering her and hopefully we can live and let live." She left the barn, and I went. Back to my work, I had the rest of the day to reflect on Bill's words. If Caitlin wanted to understand me, to act civilly and have a conversation would be more effective than her current approach of chasing after her like everyone else. That just wasn't in the cards. She didn't join us for dinner that night, a topic no one brought up and I didn't ask. The next day, I followed my routine, waking up at 5 as usual. Even on my day off after Sam and Bill left for work, I made breakfast and collected. My clean laundry, I saw I'd invested in a large commercial washer and dryer, which allowed me to wash all my clothes in one load. The laundromat was next to the kitchen, so while my clothes were washing, I sat at the kitchen table, ate, and chatted. With Colin, Caitlin came in an unusual occurrence for breakfast since I usually opted to eat later. Colin asked about my plans for the day, and I told him I was thinking of going into town. Then I asked if there was anything she wanted me to bring. She said that if she didn't mind, there were a couple of things I could get for her. Let's make sure about an hour and a half after I finished my laundry and put it away, she assured me she'd be ready. She finished preparing something to eat and sat down at the table, remaining silent, while Colin and I continued our conversation. As we left my cabin later, she came out the back door looking stunning in a turquoise summer dress that complemented her red hair. It was obvious she wanted me to notice her as she held the passenger side door open for her. I watched her as she got into the car. We started driving, and for the first half of the trip, she remained silent, observing the scenery. Suddenly, she said, "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday." I glanced at her, but she seemed to be looking out the side window and I couldn't see her face. So I said, "Well, although it would have been unpleasant. I have a rule about not forcing unwanted affection on unreceptive women." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her turn her head, and I could tell she was looking at me. She remained silent, but I noticed her occasional glances in my direction. We arrived at the general store and went inside. I needed to buy a pair of jeans and new shirts, while she had a list of things her mother wanted. An hour later, we had everything loaded. I had one more stop to make at the hardware store for a couple of things for Bill, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry. I suggested we stop to eat something and she agreed. We went into the same restaurant where I first met Billy Collin. We took a table and sat down. We were silent. I started thinking that maybe I should have gone straight to the hardware store and returned to the ranch. Just then, the door opened and 3 guys walked in. I recognized 2 of them as the guys who had come to see Caitlin. They went straight to our table, with 2 taking the seats on either side while the third stood behind me. They ignored me and started talking to her. I got up and I signaled to the third person to sit down while I moved to the next table. When the waitress brought our food, I called her over and asked her to put my food in front of me. I ate quickly, paying no attention to the conversation at Caitlin's table, throwing some bills on the table to cover our meals. I stood up. Caitlin had barely touched her food, and her plate was still full. "I'm going to stop by the hardware store. Can I stop by later and see if you're ready to go?" I said, interrupting their conversation. She pushed her plate back, stood up, and said, "It was nice seeing the guys again, but we have to go." The guys at the table tried to protest. One even offered her a ride home. She declined and followed me outside to my SUV. As I drove, I said, "Let's go to the hardware store." She stayed in the vehicle, seemingly furious. The silent tension lingered as I drove back to the ranch, pulling off the highway onto the mile-long road. "Why did you do that?" asked. "What?" I replied, unsure. "What did you mean?" "Move to the other table," she said. "Oh, that. Well, I thought you'd prefer to stop by, spend time with your friends. Besides, I didn't want to be in the middle of their competition for your attention. You're really in a hole," he wisely retorted. I kept my mouth shut. I had no desire to defend myself against his blows while driving. Upon arriving at the main house, she immediately grabbed what she could carry. As soon as I opened the back of the SUV, I collected more bags. I followed her into the house. Upon entering through the back door, she left everything on the kitchen table without saying a word to her mother. Then she headed towards the bedroom. Colin looked at me questioningly. I shrugged, saying, "I guess I'm an idiot." Colin laughed and came closer, putting a hand on my arm. "I've never seen anyone have the effect on Caitlin that you seem to have." "I guess I was born just to annoy her," I replied. "I'm not so sure about that," she said, leaving me confused. I went back to my cabin and packed my new clothes, deciding not to stay cooped up. I went to the stable and saddled a horse. Sitting outside, I ended up at the top of the waterfall. The weather was nice. I tied the horse to a tree and sat on the edge of the falls, looking down at the tranquil pool below. I sat there for half an hour, maybe more. Caitlin rode up below me, dismounting her horse, not wanting to be accused of spying. As she undressed again, I picked up a stone and threw it into the water, creating a splash. She looked around, searching for the source of the noise, and saw me, anticipating her departure. Instead, she mounted her horse and rode over to where I was sitting. Her horse was next to mine, and she approached me. I stood up, taking a few steps away from the edge in case she planned to push me. "You're in a hole," she said, stopping inches from me. "And you're still annoying," I said. This time I didn't wait for her slap. I grabbed her by the waist and kissed her quickly. Letting go, I tried to walk to my horse, but she grabbed my arm and turned me around again. I was amazed. When she reached behind my neck and pulled me for another kiss, we found ourselves in a passionate embrace again. As the passion grew, our clothes disappeared, and we enjoyed a wonderful moment. Gradually, our breathing normalized, and we remained embraced in silence. We dressed, mounted our horses, and dismounted. After stabling our horses, without saying a word, she turned and walked towards the main house. Dazed, I returned to my cabin, stepping into the shower. One thing remained. Clara harbored much stronger feelings for this adoring moment than I had acknowledged to myself before. I barely had time to dress for dinner. Upon entering the kitchen, Bill, Colin, and Sam were already present, but Caitlin was nowhere to be seen. As we took our seats, she came in, choosing the chair next to mine instead of her usual spot beside Sam. Bill and Colin exchanged glances while Caitlin simply smiled sweetly in response. During dinner, she chatted animatedly, despite her parents' curiosity. They refrained from asking why their daughter was in such a good mood. After dinner, she helped her mother clean the kitchen while Sam and I headed back to our cabins. Just as I had settled between the sheets, a soft knock sounded on my door. Wearing only my boxers, I opened it, and Caitlin entered, finding her way into my arms. We shared a tender kiss, and she guided me back to my bed, joining me after removing her clothes. We made love before falling asleep in each other's arms. The sudden arrival of 5 a.m. forced me to sleepily reach for the blaring alarm clock. With great reluctance, I managed to get out of bed, turn on the light in the bathroom, and get dressed for the day, leaving a soft kiss on her head before leaving the cabin. During breakfast, I couldn't ignore B. Collins' scrutinizing glances. I wondered if they were aware of their daughter's nocturnal whereabouts. After lunch, I loaded the truck for another day of putting up fence posts. Working alone on a ranch provided ample time for contemplation. My thoughts turned to my recent past. I was amazed that only 3 months had passed since I left my wife. It felt like a lifetime. I reflected on the importance of Bill Collins Sam in my life, and then my musings centered on the beautiful Caitlin and the moments we shared. From the previous day, I reflected on the possibility of finding the kind of love that her parents embodied. At lunch, I realized once again that I had forgotten bringing my food. I heard a truck approaching hurriedly. Caitlin jumped up and ran towards me with a bag in her hand. She lunged at me, initiating a passionate kiss before handing me the bag. Ignoring the food, I pulled her in for another passionate kiss. Although I didn't put up as many fence posts that day, I did place my post on her a couple of times in the middle of our passionate moments. We also found time to talk. I revealed the details of my past life, recounting how my ex-wife had betrayed me. The only way you'll leave is if you tell me to go. Let's make sure she went back home and I finished my work for the day after showering and changing. She was in the kitchen. When I came in again, choosing the seat next to mine halfway through dinner, there was a knock at the front door. Bill opened it and came back with the same guy who had been the first to visit Caitlin. As soon as he sat down, Caitlin looked at him with an incomprehensible expression. "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a drive," she suggested. In this part of the country where options were limited, going for a drive was basically a euphemism for going on a date. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think my boyfriend would like it," Caitlin replied. She leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. The tall, dark, and handsome man blushed and stammered before hurrying out. With that exchange, our relationship was. Now out in the open, I looked at Billy Collin, noticing approving smiles. One of them was wearing a big grin. We had officially become a couple. In the following days, there were no more visits from local men. Calling her made it clear she wasn't available. I found a way to help her with her plans. She was looking for a bank loan to buy the equipment needed for her veterinary business. The bank was hesitant to offer an unsecured loan, and the only option was for her father to put up the ranch as collateral. She was reluctant to ask him. I suggested giving me a couple of days. I might have a solution. I contacted my offshore bank, setting up an account under the guise of a fictitious lending company. Caitlin completed a loan application on my computer, which I set up to be sent to my email. After waiting a couple of days, I sent her a notification that her loan had been approved and that a wire transfer would be made to her account. She was excited by the news, but questioned why the loan only had an annual rate of 2. I explained that they were a philanthropic nonprofit group that provided loans to those they believed would contribute to the community. Although I could have offered her the money directly, I knew she was too proud to accept it, having earned her degree. Through hard work, she was determined to succeed on her own terms. When her license was approved, she had purchased a new pickup truck converted into a mobile veterinary office, complete with the necessary medical instruments. Once word got out about her licensed status, calls for her services poured in from local ranchers. Many nights, Caitlin spent time with me in my cabin. Although Bill and Colin were aware, they seemed to have no objections. At 27, she was old enough to make her own decisions. Wilson and his team faced trial 3 months later. The case was relatively straightforward. The smallest man cooperated with the prosecution, receiving 2 years of probation with no prison time. Wilson's 5. Other employees each received 5 years in prison as the mastermind behind the cattle theft. Wilson received the maximum sentence of 10 years and a $5,000 fine. When he was taken to prison, I began an investigation into him and his ranch, discovering that he was single and had no family in the area. With all his employees incarcerated, there was no one left to run the ranch. This led me to formulate a new plan. However, before putting it into action, I needed to address some issues I had unfinished. Business. I needed to finalize my divorce. The idea of Janice getting half my money wasn't something I could accept. To accomplish this, I turned to my friend Jack for help once again. Instead of emailing him, I called and asked him to speak with Janice. I wanted him to tell her that I had reached out and wished to propose a settlement in exchange for a divorce. The offer was straightforward, $5,000. If she refused, she would never hear from me again and wouldn't receive any money. Initially playing innocent, she demanded to know why I had left and why I wouldn't return. The charade ended when Jack revealed that he knew about her affair with Brandon and her intention to divorce me. With his game exposed, Janice, still working as a waitress and struggling financially, accepted my offer to proceed. I needed to return to Texas and hire a lawyer to draft the divorce papers. Caitlin wasn't thrilled when I informed her of my departure. I explained that I needed to close this chapter of my life. And let's make sure long-term from the airport, she insisted on driving me and being there upon my return. Leave behind my SUV and most of my belongings except for what would fit in a suitcase. It seemed to alleviate her worries. I left on a Sunday, and upon my arrival, Jack picked me up at the airport, staying with him and his family. I made sure to realize that I had personal items and keepsakes and storage mementos of my parents' yearbooks and other sentimental belongings. Not wanting to return for them later, I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin was surprised at first when I revealed I wasn't flying back. But once I explained that I was bringing back everything important, to me her excitement for my return grew. It took me 3 days of relentless driving to cover the distance. When I arrived at Rocking Bee Ranch on Tuesday night, I was met with an enthusiastic welcome from everyone that night. Caitlin continued to extend her warm welcome until the early hours of the morning when we finally fell asleep, completely exhausted. With the first part of my plan accomplished, I was ready to put the rest into action. This involved making several trips to the prison, where Wilson was incarcerated. My goal was to persuade him to sell me his ranch. Initially resistant, I continued presenting. In my case, I pointed out that he would be imprisoned for at least 7 years, and even with good behavior, he would not be eligible for parole. Without anyone to care for his ranch, his house and buildings would likely deteriorate, and his cattle could perish. Without proper winter care, I also raised the question of whether he would be welcome after his sentence given the prospect of ruin. Eventually, he accepted my offer, providing him with something to start over with upon his release. The next step was to secure financing. I moved my money back into the country, trusting that Giannis wouldn't jeopardize his 4,000 by taking hasty action. I negotiated a price of $5 million with Wilson below the property's actual value, which made it relatively easy to find financing. I made a down payment of $500,000 and financed the remaining amount, taking a month to finalize everything. I kept my activities secret from everyone, except Kitling Yil. I explained that I had personal business dealings related to my assets that needed attention. Although it only consumed 1 or 2 days of my time per week, I created a corporation and registered the land in his name. With summer drawing to a close and autumn settling in, I hired someone to harvest the hay on the property. I also employed 4 people to live on site and manage the ranch in the interim. The most experienced person was appointed temporary foreman. I made it clear that for a while, I would be an absentee owner. Despite my closeness to her, I reassured her and planned to visit the ranch frequently. The final element of my plan involved remodeling the main house, a 2-story 5-bedroom structure that needed modernization. Despite Caitlin's frustration with my secrecy about my activities, our relationship continued to flourish. My love for her grew each day, and I felt she felt the same way about me. Meanwhile, her veterinary business was booming, which required her to be frequently on the road, but she remained content and happy. There came a point when I almost revealed to her what I was doing. After returning from checking on the remodeling, she confronted me with questions. "What the hell is going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" I replied. "God, no. I swear there's no one else. There are just some things I need to work out, please. Believe me. I promise. I'll tell you everything soon. I ask you to trust me." She scrutinized my face, searching for the truth, and said, "Okay, Carson, I trust you, but you better tell me soon what's going on, or I'm going to beat you up." I took her and kissed her with all the love I had. As spring arrived and birthing season began, the renovation of the main house was complete. It was time to execute the last part of my plan. One afternoon, when I had Caitlin alone, I asked her to go for a drive in the truck. I told her I'd been thinking it was time for her to leave Rocking Bee Ranch. Instantly, her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "But you promised you wouldn't leave. I had planned for us to be at the entrance of the old Flydell Ranch." I got in and started driving down the private road, saying I didn't really plan on going very far. She looked around, clearly confused. I'm not sure she heard what I said. Then she asked what we were doing on Wilson's land. I delayed my answer until we got to the main house. I told her to come over, that I wanted to show her something. I got out of the truck and walked around to open the door for her. Taking her hand, I led her to the front door and opened it. She asked again, "What the hell are you doing? We could get in trouble for this." I told her to relax, that Wilson didn't own the ranch anymore, and that we should take a look around. I wanted to know what she thought of the house. I took her upstairs, and we toured the rooms, and then we went back downstairs. There was a large living room with nicely paneled decor, 2 bedrooms, converted into home offices, and finally, the kitchen. I could tell from her expression that she loved the new kitchen. Only one room had furniture, and that was the one I intended to use as my office. The rest of the house awaited her decisions about how she wanted to furnish it. I asked her what she thought of the house, and she said it was really nice. I asked her if she thought she could live there, and she asked what the hell is going on. I could see that she was confused and starting to get annoyed. I knelt down and put my hand in my jacket pocket. I told her that Wilson no longer owned the ranch that I did and asked if she could live there as my wife. In a surprised tone, she asked if I owned the house. I felt excited, and she shouted, "Yes!" Then I took the engagement ring from my pocket and held it up, proposing to her. Her face frowned, and her eyes filled with tears. At first, I thought I had made a mistake, until she pulled me onto my back and covered my face with kisses. Then, she presented her finger so I could put the ring on. She looked around the house with new eyes running from room to room and examining everything patiently. I waited until she came running back into my arms. "The house is beautiful. I love it," she exclaimed. I led her to the other side of the room to two doors that opened from a hallway. "There are two offices, one for you to run your business and one for me," I said. Earning another long kiss, I led her to the office with the desk and took out a large piece of paper. It had a drawing of a property gate, and on it said Double C Ranch. Checked it and asked what the Double C meant. I told her, "What does Carson mean?" And Caitlin Ranch cried and started pulling at my clothes, and I joined. In undressing her, I sat her on top of the desk and inaugurated the office with her love. In fact, in the days that followed, we made love in every room of our new house. Once we recovered and got dressed, I told her it was time to go tell her parents. She was so happy I think she floated to the truck. We got back a few minutes after 6, and Bill, Colin, and Sam were already ready in the kitchen for dinner. We went in together, and Kitling held up her left hand and shouted, "We're getting married." Colin got up and ran to hug his daughter, while Bill and Sam came over and shook my hand and patted me on the back. Then I got a big hug from my future mother-in-law, while Kitling hugged her dad and Sam. When things calmed down, we all sat down to eat. Caitlin waited until everyone was eating. "Of course, this means we're moving in," she said, as casually as possible. What did Bill, Colin, and Sam exclaim in unison? He looked at me and urged me to tell them. So I said, "Well, Bill, you know Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours. I thought it might be a good thing." Bill stood up looking furious and said there was no way Fly Doll was getting his ranch. I laughed and told him to calm down, that it wasn't Fly Doll anymore, but Double C Ranch and the new owners. We're sitting at his table right now in a confused state. He asked what I was talking about. I told him I bought Wilson, and now the ranch is Caitlin's and mine is Double C Ranch. Colin said he understood immediately. I said, "Bill, I thought if we combined the two ranches, we could run them. We'd split the profits 50-50. Then he said, "But Double C Ranch is more than twice the size of my ranch and makes a lot more profit." I replied, "You've done this your whole life. I need your help. I'd like us to be equal partners. You'd be in charge of operations, and what you say goes. From Caitlin's ranch, well, keep everything in the family too." He sat down, looked at Colin. She nodded, reached across the table towards me, and we shook hands. "Damn, Carson, this is going to take some getting used to. But I accept your offer," I said. "This means, well, have more hands to supervise, and that means Sam will be the head foreman, and now I can pull out all those fence posts I worked so hard to put up on that side of the property." Everyone laughed at me, and part of that night was a loud and boisterous celebration. Caitlin was alone that night in my cabin, and it wore me out. We were late for breakfast the next day, but everyone was still in the kitchen when we walked in. They were waiting for us to eat so we could all drive together to the Double C Ranch and Caitlin could show off our new house. Everyone was impressed, and I saw Colin eyeing the renovated kitchen with envy. It took Caitlin and her mother a month to furnish the house. It was ready for us to move into on our wedding night. We got married at the Double C Ranch, and her family were respected and well-liked ranchers, and families from miles around came to celebrate the day. As Caitlin's husband, son-in-law, and the new owner of the Double C Ranch, I was welcomed into their society. Later that night, we finally arrived at the bed, and we stayed there making love that night, and most of the next day we would still be there. But on our third day of marriage, I took my wife to FII for a tropical honeymoon. Our first rodeo of that year went, well, we sent many animals to market. Endo made a good profit. A significant portion went toward paying off the loan. But with Caitlin's business, we were living a comfortable life. We even built a nice new house for Sam, and now he has a girlfriend his own age who lives in the city. We may have another wedding soon. Another year has passed, and my beautiful wife has just given me the most fantastic news. She's pregnant. We're having a baby. One final word before I go. I know there are those who will say I should have learned my lesson the first time, by making Caitlin sign a prenuptial agreement. If you think that, then you don't really know Caitlin. She's not Giannis. She works hard at her job and takes care of our home. She's her mother's daughter and shares her love with me every day, only with me. Every day I look into her Irish blue eyes, I see that love.